If there's one thing which people seem to hate more than anything else, it's anything which they believe reflects poorly on themselves because of its perceived similarity to themselves. The more intensely similar we feel to something, the more pronounced the differences in our conclusions become, and the more frustrated we get when we can't reconcile these differences. When I was growing up, I viewed hate as a singularly negative emotion. I chose to fixate on things I liked, and only hated things and people that I felt had been used to aggress me in some way by the kids who made fun of or bullied me for the things that I liked. Yet still, the things I chose to lash out at were couched in my insecurities. I came to performatively avoid girls for much of my early childhood because I hated being called one all the time, but I didn't enjoy doing anything other boys did and didn't want to look or act like them either. As an anime blogger in my late teens, I resented and railed against the practice of writing hatefully negative reviews of media, of declaring shows objectively bad, which I and others considered great. A lot of my writing and analytical ability was developed just so I could explain why the things I like are in fact good. However, what I really meant is that I can justify why I like this thing just as easily as you can justify the things you like. I hate watching most anime reviews and analysis, particularly on the more critical end of the spectrum, because I just don't buy it. I can listen to someone describe their read on the show and be getting something completely different just looking at what they're showing on the screen. Truthfully, I think it's hard not to find value in almost any creative work. So if the takeaway you have from something is just that it sucks, then that's really boring. My favorite writing on bad media is from the position of fascination, from seeing what the artist is trying to do, seeing what level they were able to realize that vision to, learning about how it got to where it ended up and who dropped the ball where, and then most importantly, reconstructing, taking what we've learned from the failures and using it to imagine how the thing could have worked, to figure out what little tweaks would have bridged that gap between me and the work a little bit more. I learned how to love hate when I discovered my first ever personal lolcow, an awesomely bad show that I could get a laugh out of just describing to people, while pointing out its flaws and suggesting what it seemed to be going for and how it could have been better, or even recognizing the episodes which actually were. My love for hating this show spurred me to create a blog called I Hate B-Train, with the tagline, "Fuck this studio." The reason I felt comfortable about being so aggressive in my approach is that I had fully acknowledged the insecurity in my relationship to the work. My two favorite genres for years had been Yuri and Girls with Guns, for reasons that I hope by now you find glaringly obvious, and B-Train had made the bulk of the anime existing at this genre cross-section at the time, and I hated all of them. The dialogue was always vague, confusing, and pretentious, the animation stiff and lacking detail, and half-assed attempts to look artsy were common, the Yuri was barely even teased about in the early episodes of the shows, and the plots always moved at a snail's fucking pace, with limp-dick mystery box writing structure. God, I hated them so fucking much. Why couldn't I have a good Girls with Guns show? Ultimately, I had brazenly embraced the notion that B-Train deserved to serve as a punching bag for my frustration that there weren't better shows in the genre, because they had disappointed me by making shows in the genre which hadn't fulfilled my desires. Maybe if this story didn't have a happy ending, I'd still have a certain kind of anger inside, that I never got the show I wanted. But instead, what I have is the story of a man who has become a personal hero to me after more than 2 decades spent with his work, director Mashimo Koichi. Having started my B-Train blog over incidentally giving a shot to Madlax, my next target would be the studio's first work to which I'd been exposed, and one which had left a huge but vague impression on me for years. On some level, in fact, it may have been my first exposure to the concept of Yuri, but we'll get to that later. I will be spoiling the show to save you the trouble of watching it, because you'll likely only enjoy it if the description I give ends up compelling you to watch it regardless. It's boring as fuck and ugly on main despite that glorious OP. For me, the most important thing about Dot Hack is that it has my favorite soundtrack of all time. Tracks that I got stuck in my head for years after hearing them twice, looking up the lyrics and wrongly recalling the melodies. The advent of YouTube in 2007 let me recapture what even then had been 5-year-old memories of Aura and Fake Wings. It helped that the lyrics were in English and that Dot Hack was planned as a multinational multimedia megaseries from the beginning. The conceit is that in the future, a virtual MMO game is all the rage, and in each of the major stories, thanks to a conspiracy perpetuated by the CyberConnect 2 developers, various teens become trapped inside of this game called The World and unable to log out for reasons mysterious to them. Usually the plot is about solving the mystery of why they're trapped and how to get out, while slowly exploring the characters through the lens of an MMO most closely resembling something like Phantasy Star Online. The .hack-sign TV show followed Tsukasa, who makes Shinji Ikari seem like a tough guy, and whose behavior I did not read as strange in any way watching the show when I was 12, while my impression of the other characters had been that they were mostly kind of assholes. In other words, I was the target audience. It ran on Cartoon Network's short-lived Saturday night 7 to 11 anime slot in early 2003, which probably did the most to turn me into a diehard anime lifer with Rurouni Kenshin. I can only remember so many details, but I always recalled that in the effort to learn more about Tsukasa's identity outside of the game, other players ask for their gender, and they say that they're a boy, with a smirk. At the end of the show, when Tsukasa finally wakes up, they are in what would appear to be the body of a young woman, as they meet the woman that they fell in love with in the game, herself a very socially powerful benefactor of justice in the game world who is wheelchair-bound in real life. Before I present you with the take I've always had on this ending, I'll share one that's come to mind now that I am married to a non-binary person who was assigned female at birth, and having not rewatched the show to see if it has any more to say on the matter. Possibly, these two were using the game to escape their insecurities, being wheelchair-bound and being uncomfortable in a female body. And because they recognize this and cope together, their relationship teaches them a healthier way of living with themselves through what they bring to one another, not needing the game to facilitate a worthwhile sense of self. This take is based on the idea that Tsukasa wasn't lying when they said they were a boy. Growing up, though, I had always taken that as a lie. Tsukasa was indeed insecure about being a girl, but I'd never even considered the possibility that they actually wanted to be a boy, because the whole plot of the show is that they're trapped in this male body, and in the end they are released from it back to the girl that she really is. It wasn't until I self-identified as a trans woman in 2020 that I appreciated why I had this take. We as viewers never see Tsukasa as a girl until the end of the series, but in the first place, their gender had been in question because of their lack of masculine behaviors. The first woman to take interest in them is strong-willed, but too impatient to communicate effectively with them. The woman who falls in love with them is even more intensely strong-willed and brooding enough to be at Tsukasa's pace of introspection. For me, relating to Tsukasa and being into the type of people who seem to be interested in them, it's hard not to project onto the character as a transbian, especially considering we're talking about a show directed by Mashimo Koichi, whom, if you couldn't tell from all the Yuri Girls with Guns shows, has something to say on them, but we'll get there. After a couple of months running the I Hate B-Train blog, the Stockholm Syndrome had started settling in. By episode 12 of Madlax, I was writing my own weird hate fiction about it, and praising parts of it. I found myself enjoying the first episode of Arc the Lad, and realized that some of the studio's early work had been legitimately high quality. I also had people making arguments in my comments that while the animation wasn't the best, the shows used traditional cinematic realism in a way that wasn't common in anime. I had no idea what that meant at the time, so I couldn't really argue with it. What really took the wind out of my sails, though, was finally realizing that almost every B-Train show beyond a certain point had been directed or partially planned by Mashimo Koichi, and learned why his shows were the way they were. In the late 80s, Mashimo nearly died in a skiing accident. While hospitalized, he had a vision of creating a hospital for animators, a place for young or struggling talent at its parent company, Production IG, to train themselves in a lower-stakes environment, making niche titles following the weather vane of Mashimo Koichi's Dick and Booze. In those earlier, more ambitious days of B-Train, a man named Horikawa Kenji served as producer on the globally successful 1999 Metabots anime. A year later, he founded Studio PA Works, which 9 years later would produce Kanon, the Yuri Girls with Guns show that I had been dreaming of. Directed by Masahiro Ando, one of the best at action direction in the business, and with stunning Type Moon character designs, even though I know the second half is kinda shit, I couldn't help myself spending hundreds on the show's figures. Somehow, when Kanon aired, I had viewed it simply that this breakaway studio had done what the parent studio had never been capable of in the intervening years since its foundation. Never mind where the opportunity and inspiration to do so likely arose from in the first place. If Horikawa Kenji isn't my role model himself, Mashimo Koichi certainly is. It was hard to stay mad at B-Train once I'd stopped thinking of it as just the studio that had ruined all these Yuri shows, which wouldn't even have existed or inspired others if they hadn't made them, especially because the studio was going to fold back into Production IG in the early 2010s after Mashimo retired. Considering the quality IG continues to display in their work, I'd say these people were trained well. So that's a cute story and all, but I wasn't really prepared to have a whole other discovery of Mashimo Koichi's past. past. You see, back when I'd looked him up the first time, I'd never heard of any of his pre-B-Train work, which wasn't a part of a major franchise. And I doubt you would either, because most are very obscure and not necessarily incredible. But I can think of no better word to describe his 1986 film, iCity. This is the single most insane non-pornographic animated film I've ever seen. It's so far ahead of its time that it feels like a retro parody of Vaporwave from the year 2040 instead of a sincere 80s flick. I could talk about this movie for 20 minutes and I wouldn't be able to show you enough clips to give you a firm sense of what to expect. You have to see it for yourself and enter the labyrinth of schizophrenic storytelling and psychic mind blast imagery which just relentlessly throws new shit at you. If you enjoy consuming anime as a raw sensory experience and don't mind if the story is absolutely fucking batshit, then you need this movie in your life. iCity is something like Mashimo Koichi's End of Evangelion, and when I saw it, I immediately realized that Koichi's directing style at B-Train had almost nothing to do with his skill level, and everything to do with deliberately constructing shows in the lightest load way possible for the sake of the studio's purpose. This was confirmed for me when the Digi Collective got together to watch Mashimo's next film, The Dirty Pair Movie, and record a commentary getting too high and paying only enough attention to appreciate how much of the film outshines the technical and aesthetic achievements of many of the more famous films of that era. By that point, I was more than convinced that Mashimo Koichi had thoroughly paid his dues as a director before his time at B-Train. Most of his early work consisted of lengthy TV shows and tie-ins though, so I wasn't expecting anything else he'd done to touch the mania of iCity, and I stopped investigating for a while. Identifying myself as trans earlier this year got me thinking a lot about my history with anime and how much I'd connected with it over my desire to be a woman in my teens, while somehow thinking of it as something different. Why would Yuri and Traps and Girls with Guns and trans characters all speak to me so much if that wasn't an important part of my experience and of finding comfort in my identity? I watched more than half of Stop Hibari-kun fully convinced that it was the intentional story of a trans girl from a knowing perspective, but it still came as a surprise in their Toko Toko interview when the creator, Eguchi Hisashi, talked about how they poured so much energy into making Hibari beautiful out of a desire to be her, and how fully internalizing this led them to leave the world of weekly manga and dive into the world of obsessively crafted line art. It was such an of course moment for me. Like, of course we all got it to some degree all along, but some of us don't really know what we've got until we've looked at it for a long while. Or maybe we just convince ourselves it's something easier to deal with. But when you have a favorite Toho, when you've coated every inch of your house in cute girls, when you know the moe and the guro, when you're in too deep and you're trying to keep up above in my head instead of going under. Anyways, my mind inevitably went to Dot Hack, as it often does. After all, I rapped over a lot of its soundtrack on my album The World Over. Kaji Urayuki is my favorite anime composer, and Mashimo used her on most of his shows from Dot Hack onward. Maybe Mashimo's soundtrack supervision had an impact on that, or maybe it's just Emily Bindiger's voice scoring my dreams. After thinking about Tsukasa, and then about the Yuri Girls with Guns shows, and then some of the themes of iCity, I suddenly felt the urge to plunge into Mashimo's filmography to learn more, and I am absurdly lucky that the anime gods guided my eye to the 1992 OVA of The Weathering Continent, because it couldn't have made things clearer for me. The story opens with the main girl trying to nurse to health a child who had attacked her in desperation moments prior. After the child dies in her arms, she is shocked to learn from her androgynous companion that the child was a girl. Hearing this causes her to remember a moment when she had cut off her hair and renounced her womanhood. Over the course of the OVA, we learn that the main girl became tough in order to help her sick older brother. At the end, she is confronted with a phantom of herself as she looked as a woman, offering her to live in eternal comfort by returning to her true sense of self, which she even admits is who she really wants to be inside. She rejects the offer, however, stating that this world is too dark to live in as a woman, basically admitting that yes, she is forcing herself to wear a mask because it's the only decision that she views as responsible in her mission to protect others in this broken world. Now, I'm not interested in speculating on the gender identity of a 68-year-old retiree, but I do think it's hilarious that Mashimo's first original series as director, the 50-episode preteen-oriented mecha series Gold Lightan, goes all in on the machine as phallus symbolism, compounding it as often as possible onto an otherwise straightforward coming-of-age story about a young badass. The show's themes are perhaps best distilled into this scene from the start of episode 4, which begins with all of the boys in the main kid's class speculating on why the one girl in the school hasn't shown up yet. The creepy-ass teacher immediately suggests that because she's a girl, she probably wants to look at something more exciting than the ugly faces of the other boys, such as the face of a handsome man. As he says this, he strokes his chin, as if identifying himself as handsome, as defined by his jawline. But think about what he's implying. She isn't here looking at his face right now, so he's basically dissing himself, while also transparently making clear his lecherous feelings towards his student. In case you're wondering, there's nothing about this girl's personality which would suggest that she might skip school to flirt with guys, so that's what this guy is just projecting her to be doing with some other guy than him. None of the other kids are fazed by this weird assumption, and one quickly posits the speculation that the girl has been seeming down lately. This spurs the conversation in a non-committal direction until the main character gets frustrated at the thought that his friend might be struggling and just straight up bails out the window to go personally ask what's up. When he gets to her place, she's longingly staring at a photo and a letter, but perks up when the boy comes to the window and heads over to greet him. He asks if the letter is a love letter, and she teases that it is. From her father, that is. As the boy knows, her father is out of the country. He was supposed to come home soon, but got bumped back, and she's bummed about it. As soon as the boy realizes how easily he can abate this particular pathos, he immediately invites her to his house for a party, and she agrees. When they get back to his place, the boy finds out that he has to help his dad with mechanic work and he can't properly entertain the girl. But it's more than clear that he's already won. He cared enough to leave school and check on her just on a rumor that she wasn't feeling well, and then brought her out of her negative feelings, all because he rightfully cares more about talking to cute blondes than learning nothing with a bunch of geeks and a pedophile. From here, his little sister picks up the ball and entertains the girl until her dad comes home early and she kisses the boy for his efforts. Why couldn't any of the other boys have gotten that kiss? The teacher fantasizes that she is skipping school to be with a guy like him, but hopefully out of decency and not out of insecurity, he isn't pursuing her. The kids who recognized her change in demeanor either write it off, have nothing to say about it, or do nothing about it. Our boy does something and gets something out of it, and that's what makes him the hero. I wish I could say that I can't even imagine the kind of ops that Mashimo Koichi must have faced throughout his career, but that would be a lie, because I literally was one. I ran I Hate B-Train. And even if it was all in good fun, and the vitriol of the posts was largely put on, my feelings about the studio and director couldn't have been more different when I started that site from how they are now. Mashimo Koichi was only 23 in 1975 when he started in the industry as an assistant director and rose to episode director on Time Bokan, and then debuted as a series director with his next show being 1978's 51-episode sequel to the popular Gatchaman series, followed by yet another 48-episode follow-up before he was on to originals with Laitan in 81. Right from the start, his works featured trippy imagery, richly detailed and unique color palettes, and a general penchant for striking symbolic imagery. His shows were tightly made, highly accessible, and more than anything, just basically entertaining. My relationship with Mashimo's work remains complex, as even among the older shows of his which I think are good, I don't know if I will connect with any of it as strongly as iCity, because even having been based on a manga, that's the one where it really didn't seem to be for the studio in any way. It's just the full brunt of his madness collapsing your skull in. I'm certain that I wouldn't have a great deal of the nice things that I do if not for his influence, and I certainly wouldn't have taken so much inspiration myself. The proper response to wishing that B-Train's Yuri shows were better would have been to make one myself. Horikawa Kenji did that, and he didn't have to learn how to tell a story through the medium of anime to do it. He told it through the medium of organizing people. B-Train's production meetings famously involve alcohol in the formation of storylines, and it shows. Mashimo is just hanging loose with his crew, making up shit that he could find excuses to pay them to draw. A hospital for animators. I hope that I can be and have been a kind of hospital myself, but for whom I'm not sure yet. Between Mashimo and Horikawa, I've got a lot of notes to take, including on what not to do, but that's how any child should regard the ones they recognize as part of their collection of parents. With much respect, some reverence, and a burning desire to do it better. Help me do my own life better by supporting the Digi Collective on Patreon, and hire me on Fiverr to use my voice for whatever you need it for. If you want to hear me talking about currently airing anime with my buddy Best Guy Ever, subscribe to Cantant, where we're about to launch into a full revisitation of ReZero from the beginning. DM me on Twitter if you want to send me crypto. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.